Hello. So we are going to be having you watch the first of a couple lecture videos I made here. This is lecture video part one on the Ford years. So when you're done with this, go to part two. You could be using the second half of the 1970s note sheet to use as you go through with this. So we're going to begin with post-Watergate America. As you know, President Nixon resigned on August 9th, 1974. And Nixon's resignation was that final blow in what had been really 11 years from the death of Kennedy, through all the chaos that came in the second half of the 60s and early 70s, through the end of Vietnam, and now Watergate. And it marks really 11 years of chaos. Americans who were a decade earlier trusting, conformist, believing of those in authority, are none of the above by the mid 1970s. Americans are cynical, distrustful, tend to believe that their highest officials are lying to them rather than telling them the truth. So it's a different country. And that's the country that Gerald Ford enters in on August 9th, 1974 at noon to be the nation's 38th president. Ford's job is a difficult one, as difficult maybe as almost any president who's taken the office. First off, he's not an elected president. In a fitting climax to this wacky period, Gerald Ford's the first man to ever take office without having received a vote to be either president or vice president. He was not Nixon's running mate in either 68 or 72. That was Spiro Agnew. And when Nixon won his 49 state landslide in 72, Agnew was on the ballot again, and he was re-inaugurated in January of 73 as the vice president. But Agnew, as we touched on in class, was afflicted by a scandal in 1973 completely unrelated to Watergate. Went back to his days as governor of Maryland, where there were allegations of extortion, bribery, tax evasion. And while Agnew denied all of these, a federal prosecutor who was going after him was threatening charges. And ultimately, later that year, Agnew resigns, and there's a partial deal that's made where he resigns, and ultimately charges and of a criminal nature do not go against him. So here's Nixon with no vice president, embroiled in the Watergate scandal, all at the same time. Had Watergate not been a thing, Nixon may have chosen someone who, like Agnew, who was more conservative. There was speculation maybe former Governor John Connally, the one who rode with Kennedy and got shot on that fateful day in 63. He's since switched from being a Democrat to a Republican, as more and more Democrats in the South were doing. However, that would have been a tough confirmation battle, and the way the 25th Amendment to the Constitution works now, which again we've touched on a little in class, is that now if you have a vacancy in the vice presidency, it doesn't sit vacant like it used to until the next term. A president can pick a new vice president pending a majority of the Senate confirming. Well, with Watergate dogging Nixon in every way, he didn't have time for a tough confirmation battle, so he picked Gerald Ford. Everybody liked Gerald Ford. Republican, Democrat, he was an easy confirmation. So Jerry Ford becomes the vice president without ever being voted for by the people. Then, of course, when Nixon resigns in August of 74, Ford assumes the presidency. In the initial days of the Ford presidency, he's a breath of fresh air. You can tell immediately he is different than the past three presidents, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, who we know none of their presidencies ended well. Ford evokes more the image of the guy next door. Now, while he is very much of Washington, he has been in Congress now as a member of the U.S. House, the House Minority Leader, and then briefly Vice President for the better part of a quarter of a century. However, Ford is also somebody who has never, even in all that time in Congress, lost his guy next door, friendly type nature, or his roots that often take him back to where he's from, which is Michigan. Give you a little background into Ford. He was born in the early 20th century. His birth name was actually not Gerald Ford, It was Leslie King. Gerald Ford is a name that he'll assume as a very young child by his mother's doing, but Leslie King was his birth name. Born in 1913, he had very little relationship with his birth father. His mother actually left his birth father while he was a baby. She met a man by the name of Gerald Ford, who she ultimately married, and because she thought he was a much better man, the first husband had reportedly been abusive, because she found a man who she thought was a much better man, she wanted him to be the father of her young son, Leslie. So after her divorce from her first husband and her marriage to her next, she renamed, or she legally changed the name of Leslie King to Gerald Rudolph Ford. And that's how he got the name. He was raised in western Michigan, the Grand Rapids area, where he was always known to be quite respected even in his youth, an honest, hardworking young man. He rose to the rank of Eagle Scout. Interesting to close the story with his birth father. One day when he's 16, he's pumping gas as a job, and a big vehicle pulls up with a family, and the wife and children get out of the car and walk inside the store that's part of the gas station, and a well-dressed man who looks like he's got a fair bit of money walks out of the car. He walks up to young Gerald and he says, "I'd like to introduce myself, son. I'm your father." This is, of course, Mr. King. He shakes his hand. He places a $10 bill in his hand, and Gerald never sees him again. Ford goes on. He's a good athlete. He's a football player. And he goes on to play for the University of Michigan, where he helps lead them to national championships in 1932 and 33. He is a very good player, but he is not going to ultimately go into a pro career. So what is he going to do? Ford decides to go to law school. Well, there he meets a young woman by the name of Betty Bloomer, who he marries not long after. Her name becomes Betty Ford. Ford serves in the Navy in World War II. So he's got a long history ever before he spends one day in politics. He goes back to Grand Rapids with his wife Betty. They have children. Ford is a respected member of the community. And now in his 30s, a lot of people of Grand Rapids encourage him to run for Congress. There's a House seat in Grand Rapids, a district that had traditionally been very Republican, but going back to the days of the New Deal, Depression era, when a lot of seats that were quite Republican went Democrat, the Democrats have held this one for some time, and many Western Michigan residents say it's time for the Republicans to take it back. Ford runs in 1948. He's convinced to run, and he wins. He goes to Congress as a member of the U.S. House in 1949, and he will serve in that position until he resigns it in 73 to become the vice president. He ultimately becomes the House minority leader because during his time in the House, other than for a very brief time in the early 50s, the Republicans are the minority party. Ford's dream was to one day be the Speaker of the House, but that dream was never going to come true unless Republicans could take a majority, which they never could during that time. He serves on the Warren Commission. He's one of several prominent people who are on the commission that gets all the evidence we talked about, looking into the assassination of JFK. So, I mean, this is a man who has a very impressive resume, but Ford had zero aspirations to be President of the United States. Never was a thing that he planned on. But now he is. And on August 9th, 1974, Gerald Ford takes the oath of office and gives an inaugural speech in the White House. He tells the American people our long national nightmare is over, meaning Watergate. And the tone of his speech is, we have to move on. Ford is honest with the American people that he never really dreamt of being president, but now that he's in the job, he's going to do all he can to be a good one. He can be self-deprecating. He says, I'm not a Lincoln, I'm a Ford. Now, he could have talking about cars, but he's really talking about the fact that he doesn't see himself as one seeking to emulate the greatest like Abe Lincoln. He's just going to be himself, Gerald Ford, and lead that to wherever it may go. The country's troubled when he takes office, but again, he's a breath of fresh air. In the earliest days of his presidency, he doesn't move into the White House immediately, so television camera crews head to his townhome in the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C., and they go in his home, and there he is, making coffee and English muffins for himself and his wife, Betty. He's kind of a funny guy. Seems to just be honest, good character, and not of that king-like imperial presidency that we had seen in the last 3 administrations. So his popularity in his first few weeks on the job is high. He's untainted by Watergate, not tied at all to Nixon in that respect. However, the biggest decision of the Ford presidency is going to be made very early in his presidency. On September 8th, 1974, just about 30 days into his presidency, Ford issues a full and complete pardon to Richard Nixon for any and all crimes he might have ever committed against the United States while president involving Watergate. Whether you know this or not, it's been in the news a lot lately because of what President Biden did with his son Hunter this past week when he pardoned him. But presidents have an awesome power in the Constitution, the power to pardon. Pardon means you can be freed of or pardoned for, cleared of, any conviction that has ever been handed down by the federal courts against you, any charges that are in place against you that are federal, or any charges that could be brought against you of a federal nature. I say federal because state charges, that's a state power. Typically, governors have that pardon power. But from a federal standpoint, any crimes related to Watergate against Nixon would have been federal. Ford is effectively saying Richard Nixon can never be tried, convicted, imprisoned, none of that, for anything related to Watergate. Ford's rationale is we have to put the long national nightmare behind us. And I can't do that as president. We can't do that as a country if for the next 2 years we're dealing with the trial of Richard Nixon. Ford says Nixon has paid enough, the ultimate price of resigning his presidency, the disgrace of that goes in the history books. And Ford believes that to move on as a nation, we have to put Watergate in the rearview mirror. History judges Ford's pardon kindly, but that's over time. In the immediate aftermath of the pardon, it is not popular. The wounds of Watergate are fresh, and many Americans are so angry at Nixon, including many Republicans, that he did this. And a lot of Americans felt that this was giving him a pass, whereas others who were going to jail over Watergate, all the president's men, did not get such a pass. So Ford's popularity plummets in his first month. He falls like 20 points overnight. But Ford, to his dying day, said, I would make that decision every time. If I had to do 100 times, I'd do it every time. And if it cost me my own term as president, so be it. Richard Nixon is free and clear. The Watergate saga is over. We move on with new struggles. I'd like you to stop because this part of the video is going to end. And before you watch part 2 of this lecture, please watch the excerpt of Ford's pardon that I've left for you to watch. It's a few minutes, and you'll get to hear Gerald Ford and his rationale for why he pardoned President Nixon. So watch that, and then move on to the second part of this lecture.